My husband once told me, from now on, I'll be the one who decides when we talk or spend time together. Stop chasing me. Then he added, almost casually, I can't believe I ever lowered myself enough to marry you. You were never, and never will be, anywhere near my level. So, I stopped. 2 weeks of silence later, he showed up at my workplace, suddenly wanting back the woman he thought he had broken. Those same cruel words, that I was beneath him, were spoken by my husband Daniel one Tuesday night in October while I stood in our dining room wearing the dress I had chosen to celebrate receiving the Teacher of the Year award. He had come home 3 hours late to the special dinner I had prepared, barely looked at the table I had set with our wedding china and flickering candles, and then delivered what he clearly saw as a long overdue correction to our marriage. From that night on, he declared, he would decide when we talked or spent time together. He told me to stop chasing him around like some desperate puppy, and then, as if to seal my humiliation, he compared our salaries, as though a person's value could be measured on a spreadsheet. My $50,000 a year teacher's salary against his upcoming partnership at a prestigious law firm. He announced that we were not equals. Then he walked past me into his office, shut the door, and left me standing there alone with cold salmon and dying candles. I didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't knock on the door asking for explanations. Instead, something inside me froze, calm, hard, and crystal clear, like ice forming on a winter lake. If my husband wanted silence and distance, if he truly believed marrying me had been an act of lowering himself, then I would give him exactly what he had demanded, so perfectly that 2 weeks later, he'd be standing in my school lobby, holding roses, begging for the woman he thought he had destroyed. Before I go on, I want to thank you for being here, for listening to stories about strength and self-worth. If you believe no one should ever be told they are beneath their partner's level, please subscribe. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. And also tell us where you're watching from. We love knowing how far our stories travel. Now, let's see how Emily's powerful story unfolds. But before that day came, I need to explain how we reached that moment, because the cruelty of that October night didn't appear out of nowhere. It had been building for months, growing slowly and small, cutting ways I kept excusing, pretending not to notice, brushing off each little wound until all those moments combined into something I could no longer ignore. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing that dinner, focusing on every detail. The salmon was pan-seared exactly the way Daniel's mother had taught me back in the early months of our marriage, when she still pretended to believe I was good enough for her son. The asparagus was roasted with just the right amount of olive oil and sea salt. I had driven to 3 different stores to find the specific bottle of Pinot Noir he preferred, the one that cost $45, a large part of my weekly grocery budget. I carefully set out our wedding china, the kind we only used for special occasions. Those dishes had been gifts from our relatives 3 years earlier, people who truly believed they were investing in a lasting marriage. The candles were the expensive kind that burned evenly without smoke, arranged neatly in the crystal holders we had registered for but rarely used. That dinner was meant to mean something. After 6 years of teaching second grade, pouring my heart into helping 7-year-olds learn to read, write, and think critically about the world, I had been named Teacher of the Year at my school. The recognition came with a small bonus that I had already planned to put toward my student loans, which I was still paying off. Those were the same loans I had taken out to support us through Daniel's final year of law school when money was tight and I worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. More than the money, though, the award meant validation. It meant proof that what I did mattered, that the long hours, emotional energy, and genuine care I brought to my classroom had been seen and appreciated. I wanted to share that joy with my husband. I wanted Daniel to look at me the way he used to in our first year together, when he would introduce me at firm events with his hand resting proudly on the small of my back and tell his colleagues I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. I wanted him to be proud of me the way I had been proud of him when he passed the bar exam, when he won his first big case, when the managing partner started describing him as future partnership material, despite his youth. That night, 6:30 came and went with no word from him, apart from a text he'd sent at 5 saying he'd be home by 6:30. I checked my phone again and again, watching the minutes slip into hours. 7 o'clock passed. Then 8. The salmon stayed warm in the oven but lost its perfect texture. The asparagus grew limp. The candles burned down another inch. I texted him twice, asking if everything was okay and if he still planned to come home for dinner. He didn't reply to either message. By 9 o'clock, I had shifted from worried to resigned. It wasn't the first time Daniel had been hours late without explanation or apology. Over the past 6 months, it had become a pattern I kept defending. He was under enormous pressure at work. The partnership review demanded all his attention. Important clients needed him at unpredictable hours. Big cases required long nights at the office. I repeated those excuses to myself again and again, building elaborate justifications for behavior that, deep down, I knew was simply disrespect disguised as professional commitment. When the door finally opened at 9:30, I stood from the dining room table where I'd been sitting in the dimming candlelight. For one fleeting moment, my heart lifted with irrational hope. Maybe he would apologize. Maybe he would notice the effort I had made. Maybe we could still salvage something from that evening. Daniel walked in wearing one of his expensive suits, his tie already loosened around his neck, his focus glued to his phone. He didn't look at the table set with our best china, didn't smell the food I'd kept warm, didn't see the candles still flickering. He just walked past the dining room and headed straight toward his home office, his thumbs moving across the screen in that constant motion that had become more familiar to me than his touch. I stepped quickly into the hallway to stop him before he disappeared behind his office door. The words came rushing out, bright, eager, full of hope, a tone that now embarrasses me when I remember it. I told him about the award, about being chosen as Teacher of the Year, about the ceremony that would take place next month at the district gala. My voice carried excitement and the desperate need for him to care, to show even the smallest sign that my achievement mattered to him. Daniel raised one hand without looking up from his phone. That small, dismissive gesture hurt worse than any cruel remark. It was the same kind of motion you'd use to silence an interruption during an important call, or to wave away a waitress trying to refill your glass when you didn't want to be bothered. He stopped in the hallway and finally looked at me. His expression showed no pride or warmth, only irritation that I had delayed him from something he clearly considered more important than me. When he finally spoke, his tone was clinical, precise, completely devoid of emotion, the same tone he probably used when delivering bad news to a client or to opposing counsel. He told me that we needed to set new ground rules for our marriage. The phrase sounded rehearsed, like he had been practicing it during his drive home or even planning it for weeks. From now on, he said, he would decide when we talked or spent time together. He told me to stop chasing him like a desperate puppy, always begging for scraps of attention. It's exhausting, he said. Honestly, it's beneath both of us. He paused for a moment, loosening his tie with one hand while still holding his phone in the other. Even then, he didn't look up from the screen, not once. It was as if even this moment, when he was redefining our marriage, wasn't worth his full attention. Then came the words that would replay in my head through every sleepless night afterward, words that would mark the point where everything changed. He said he couldn't believe he had ever lowered himself to marry me, that I was never and would never be anywhere near his level. He laid it out with the detached precision of a lawyer presenting a case he knew he would win. I was a second-grade teacher earning $50,000 a year. He was about to make partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in the state, with a salary at least 3 times mine. We were not equals, he said, and he was tired of pretending we were. His words weren't spoken as an opinion but as a judgment, as though my worth as a human being could be measured by our incomes and found catastrophically insufficient. Then he walked past me into his office and closed the door. The click of the latch echoed through the house with cold finality. I stood there in the hallway between the dining room and his office, unable to move, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Behind that door, I could hear his faint voice, probably talking to a client or colleague, continuing work that, in his mind, mattered more than the wife he had just destroyed. I slowly walked back to the dining room and looked around. The salmon on our wedding china was cold and stiff. The asparagus had gone soft. The pricey bottle sat open on the table. The candles burned low in their crystal holders. Everything looked different now, changed by his words from a celebration into evidence of my foolish hope and supposed inadequacy. This was what it looked like when someone earning $50,000 a year tried to believe she deserved recognition, respect, or simple kindness from a man about to make partner at a prestigious firm. I didn't cry that night. That surprised me later, because tears would have been the natural response to hearing your husband tell you that marrying you had been beneath him. But instead of sorrow or heartbreak, something else came, something cold and sharp and unyielding. It felt like water freezing into ice, like steel hardening in fire. The man I had married, the man whose name I carried, the one I had supported through law school by working 2 jobs, taking out loans, and sacrificing my own financial safety, had just told me I would never be good enough. He had reduced my worth to numbers on a spreadsheet, our marriage, an act of charity instead of a partnership. Standing there in the dining room, staring at the closed office door, I made a decision. If Daniel wanted silence, if he wanted distance, if he wanted control over when we communicated, if he truly believed he had lowered himself by marrying me, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would meet his request with perfect precision until he understood the scale of his mistake. I would respect his boundaries so completely that he would see what his life truly looked like without the invisible support I had been providing for 3 years. Moving slowly, almost ceremonially, I cleared the table, wrapped the uneaten salmon in foil, and placed it in the refrigerator where it would sit untouched for days before I threw it away. I blew out the candles, watching the thin trails of smoke rise toward the ceiling. I put the wedding china back piece by piece, wondering if we would ever use it again, already knowing the answer. Then I picked up the bottle of expensive Pinot Noir and poured it down the kitchen sink, watching the dark wine swirl away, $45 disappearing down the drain, a perfect symbol for that night and maybe for our entire marriage. Afterward, I went upstairs to the guest room and closed the door, setting my own boundary to match his. Sleep didn't come, but plans did. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind clearing with each passing minute. Even through the shock, I realized Daniel had just handed me something precious without realizing it. He'd just freed me from trying. Permission to stop walking on eggshells. Permission to stop being the only one in our marriage who cared whether it survived. He had declared the rules, and I would follow them with flawless obedience until he finally understood what he had lost. The next morning, I woke before dawn and moved through the house with quiet determination. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, but only 1 cup. I cooked breakfast, but only for 1 person. When Daniel appeared from our bedroom around 7, adjusting his cuff links and checking his phone, he stopped in the kitchen doorway, confusion flickering briefly across his face. For 3 years, I had made his breakfast every morning without fail, his egg white omelet with finely chopped vegetables, his whole wheat toast, his coffee prepared exactly how he liked it, 1 sugar, a splash of cream. The habit was so ingrained that he no longer noticed it. He expected it, the way people expect the lights to turn on when they flip a switch. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and simple breakfast, watching him calmly. I told him I assumed he'd prefer to handle his own meals from now on since he was so capable, and since I was, apparently, far beneath his standards. My service, I said gently, was no longer required. My voice was calm and polite, with no trace of anger or sarcasm, and that seemed to confuse him more than the missing breakfast. Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak but then hesitated. He grabbed his briefcase from the counter, where I used to leave it for him along with his dry cleaning and reminders, but none of those things were there now. He stood for a few seconds, looking around the kitchen as if searching for something he couldn't quite identify, then turned toward the door. I watched him leave without offering the goodbye kiss that had once been automatic, without reminding him about his meeting, without asking when he'd be home for dinner. When the door closed behind him, I sat alone at the table, sipping my coffee as silence filled the room. But the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt spacious, full of possibility. It felt like freedom. That first day of my quiet rebellion was harder than I'd expected, not because I missed him, but because breaking 3 years of habit was like learning to breathe differently. My body had learned to exist in a rhythm built around him, and now I was asking it to unlearn everything. Later that morning, during recess, my second graders played outside under the supervision of the playground monitor. I sat at my desk with my phone lying next to my lesson planner and felt my hand reach for it out of pure reflex. My thumb hovered over the screen, ready to open my messages, muscle memory preparing to type the same old text, asking how his morning was going or whether he needed me to pick something up on my way home. I stopped myself just before touching the screen, pulling my hand back as if the phone had suddenly turned hot. It happened again during my planning period, and again while my students were at lunch. Each time, I had to stop myself from acting on the instinct that had been reinforced daily for 3 years. Instead of letting that reflex take over, I decided to redirect that energy somewhere new. I picked up my phone and texted my sister, Sarah, asking if she wanted to have dinner sometime that week. We hadn't spent real time together in months because I always seemed to have something I needed to do for Daniel. Sarah responded almost immediately, her message filled with enthusiasm and 3 exclamation points. She said she'd been worried about me and would love to catch up. Encouraged, I messaged my friend Megan next, someone I'd been neglecting because Daniel always seemed to need something during the evenings when I might have spent time maintaining friendships. Megan wrote back right away, teasing that she thought I had forgotten she existed and suggesting we meet for drinks after work on Friday. I even replied to an email from Laura, the 5th grade teacher down the hall whose lunch invitations I had declined at least 6 times over the past year because I always rushed home to make sure Daniel had a proper dinner waiting. That afternoon, I finally walked into the teacher's lounge carrying my lunch. Laura looked up from her salad with genuine surprise. She'd been sitting alone at one of the small round tables, grading papers as she ate, and her face lit up when she saw me. I asked if I could join her, and she immediately pushed her stack of papers aside to make room. We didn't talk about anything important. She told me about her upcoming spring break trip to Costa Rica, showing me pictures on her phone of the eco-lodge where she'd booked a room. She complained about a parent conference she was dreading the next week, a mother who refused to believe her daughter needed extra reading help. She vented about the new principal's questionable policies on standardized test prep. As we talked, I realized how much I had missed these simple, ordinary conversations with another adult, moments that had nothing to do with managing Daniel's moods or anticipating his needs or making sure his life ran smoothly. When Laura asked how my week was going, I found myself telling her about my Teacher of the Year award. Her reaction was everything Daniel's hadn't been. She grabbed my arm and actually squealed with excitement, insisting I completely deserved the recognition and that she had always thought I was one of the best teachers in the school. We spent the rest of lunch talking about the ceremony, what I should wear, whether I'd give a speech. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the lunch period, I felt lighter, as though something inside me had released a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. By day 3, something unexpected shifted. That morning, I went through my routine, showering, dressing, getting ready for work. And somewhere between brushing my teeth and putting on my shoes, I realized I hadn't thought about Daniel once. I hadn't wondered what time he'd be home. I hadn't mentally reviewed his schedule or planned what he might want for dinner. I hadn't checked my phone to see if he'd texted overnight. The realization froze me mid-motion, toothbrush still in my mouth. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel wasn't running quietly in the background of my mind. At school, I taught my 2nd graders about the water cycle with genuine focus and enthusiasm. We did a small experiment with ice cubes and warm water to demonstrate evaporation and condensation. I was fully present for the first time in years, not thinking ahead to dinner plans or worrying whether I'd forgotten something he needed. During recess, I helped 2 boys settle a dispute over who got to use the basketball court. I handled it with patience and humor instead of the distracted, tired efficiency I'd been running on for months. I planned next week's lessons without once glancing at my phone. The mental space that had been filled with Daniel's demands was suddenly available for other things. I felt physically lighter, as if I'd been carrying a heavy backpack for years and had finally taken it off. At lunch with Laura, I actually tasted my food. The crisp sweetness of apple slices. The texture of the bread. The cold, refreshing tea I'd brought from home. For the first time in years, I wasn't eating mechanically while thinking about someone else's needs. Laura noticed before I did. Tilting her head, she smiled and said I seemed different somehow. Lighter, she said. She asked if something good had happened. I told her I was just making a few life adjustments. She didn't press for details, just smiled with quiet understanding, as if she knew that sometimes the best changes come from finally letting go of what's been weighing you down. The transformation gathered momentum with every passing day, like a stone rolling downhill. I started going to the gym before school, something I had stopped years ago because Daniel used to complain that I was never home in the mornings. His complaint had never made sense since he left for work before 6 and wouldn't have noticed my absence anyway. But I had stopped going because his criticism made me feel guilty. Now I reclaimed that routine. I drove to the gym at 5:30, spent 45 minutes on the treadmill and weight machines, and arrived at school energized instead of drained. I reconnected with old friends I had let drift away over the past 3 years. Megan and I met for drinks on Friday evening at a downtown wine bar and talked for 3 hours straight, and not once did I check my phone. My college friend Jessica invited me to brunch that weekend, and I accepted without wondering whether Daniel might want me home that day. These friendships had faded because Daniel always seemed to need something during the hours I could have spent maintaining connections outside our marriage. I hadn't realized how isolated I had become until I started rebuilding those bridges. On Wednesday evening of my second week, I did something I'd been wanting to do for years. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center. The class met every Wednesday from 6 to 8, time I used to spend preparing elaborate dinners that Daniel barely acknowledged. I walked into the studio feeling both nervous and excited. I was greeted by Diane, the instructor. She looked to be in her mid-60s, with short silver hair and bits of clay always under her fingernails. Her face was kind, the kind of face that had clearly seen hard times and grown stronger through them. Diane welcomed me warmly and showed me to a pottery wheel in the corner. She demonstrated how to center the clay, her hands moving with practiced confidence. I tried to mimic her, but my first attempt collapsed into a lopsided lump within seconds. She laughed softly and told me everyone started that way. She said pottery required patience and a willingness to fail again and again before something beautiful emerged. Then she shared something personal. She had been teaching pottery for 20 years, ever since her second divorce forced her to rebuild her life from the ground up. She said she had needed something that was completely her own, something no one could criticize, diminish, or take away. Pottery became that thing. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to understand more than I had said and told me that sometimes the best things we create come from the rubble of what we thought we wanted. Her words settled over me like a quiet blessing. I spent the rest of that class working with the clay, my hands clumsy but determined. Nothing I made looked remotely presentable, but that wasn't the point. As the wheel spun beneath my fingers, something inside me began to shift. Each lump of clay that collapsed felt like a release. I was rebuilding something new from the ruins of my marriage, and whatever came of it, good or bad, would belong entirely to me. On the 7th day, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. During my lunch break, I drove to a bank across town, one Daniel would never have any reason to visit. My hands were shaking as I parked the car. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, and the soft background music did little to steady my nerves. My heart pounded as I walked to the counter and asked to speak with someone about opening a new account. A young woman who looked barely out of college greeted me with a professional smile and led me to her desk. She walked me through the paperwork with quiet efficiency, her tone calm, polite, never prying. She didn't ask why I wanted an account in my name only or why none of the forms listed a spouse. I was grateful for that silence. When it was done, I opened a checking account that existed entirely under my control. I arranged for small automatic transfers from my paycheck, amounts so minor that Daniel would never notice. It was a quiet beginning, a safety net built in secrecy, one deposit at a time. That same week, I scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney. I found Karen through an online search for lawyers who specialized in high-asset divorces, the kind where one spouse earned significantly more than the other. Her office was downtown, on the 23rd floor of a glass high-rise that exuded quiet power, all polished wood and expensive leather. Karen listened to my story with an intensity that made me feel both protected and slightly afraid. Her eyes were sharp, focused, the eyes of someone who knew exactly how to dismantle arrogance. She took notes in neat, deliberate handwriting and asked precise questions. She wanted every detail, about our finances, about the student loans I had taken to support Daniel through law school, about the 2 jobs I had worked while he studied for the bar exam. When she finished listening, she leaned back slightly in her chair and explained that in our state, his upcoming partnership, along with the significant salary increase that came with it, would be considered marital property subject to division. Because I had financially supported his education and early career, I had a legitimate claim. When Karen smiled, it wasn't kind. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how to make Daniel regret every cruel word he had ever said to me. I left her office that afternoon with a plan, a timeline, and for the first time since that terrible Tuesday night, I felt something like hope flicker inside me. By around the 10th day, I started noticing changes in Daniel. They were small at first, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. In the mornings, during the brief moments when our paths crossed in the house we still technically shared, he seemed lost. He'd come out of the bedroom looking disoriented, moving through the kitchen like a man in unfamiliar territory. I'd hear the rhythmic sound of cabinet doors opening and closing, interrupted by long pauses that suggested he was trying to remember where things were, or wondering why they weren't where he expected them to be. His favorite coffee mug sat untouched in the cabinet. For 3 years, that mug had been waiting for him each morning, filled exactly the way he liked it, 1 sugar, a splash of cream, hot but not scalding. Now it gathered dust while I used my own mug and made just enough coffee for 1 person. Some mornings, I'd see him from the corner of my eye as I made breakfast. He'd open the cabinet, glance at the empty mug, then close it again without touching it. He never asked about the missing coffee, never mentioned the change. But the confusion in his body language was unmistakable, a small hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty. Then there was the dry cleaning. For 3 years, every Thursday, I had picked up his shirts and suits from the cleaner on my way home from school. It had been efficient, the shop was right between work and home, and Daniel always had evening meetings or court appearances that required freshly pressed clothing. Now, his dress shirts hung at the cleaner, neatly bagged, yellow tickets still attached, waiting for someone who would never come. That Thursday evening, I overheard him on the phone with the cleaner. His voice sounded irritated and confused as he asked why his order hadn't been picked up like usual. The kitchen told its own quiet story of neglect. The groceries I used to buy, chosen carefully around his preferences, were gone, replaced by the things I liked. I filled the fridge with my favorite snacks, simple breakfast items, and ingredients for 1-person meals I could cook quickly after work. Daniel would open the refrigerator and stand there for long stretches, staring at the shelves as if trying to translate a language he no longer understood. He searched for the prepped meals I used to have waiting, the ingredients for his favorite dishes, the specific brand of yogurt he preferred. None of it was there anymore. I would walk past him during these moments without offering help or asking questions. My expression was calm, polite, distant, the way you might act toward a polite stranger rather than the man you once shared a life with. When our paths crossed in the hallway, I'd smile pleasantly and keep walking. When we were both in the kitchen, I'd prepare my food, eat it quietly, and make small, meaningless comments about the weather or a reminder that trash day was Thursday. Nothing more. One evening, near the end of the second week, Daniel finally broke the silence I had been so carefully maintaining. I was sitting in the living room reading a thriller I'd borrowed from the library, a story about a woman who slowly and methodically dismantled her abusive ex-husband's life through careful planning and patience. Daniel appeared in the doorway around 8 o'clock, watching me for a few seconds before speaking. When he finally did, his voice carried something I had never heard from him before: uncertainty. It was hesitant, almost vulnerable, nothing like the confident tone he used for clients or in court. He asked if everything was okay. I looked up from my book and smiled with polite calm. I told him everything was fine, that I was simply respecting his boundaries and giving him the space he had requested. I reminded him that he had said he would decide when we talked or spent time together. So, I was waiting for him to decide. The logic was perfect, airtight. How could he possibly argue with it? I was giving him exactly what he had asked for. He stood there for a few seconds, his lips parting as if to respond, then closing again. Finally, he nodded once, turned, and went back into his office. I returned to my book, a small current of satisfaction running through me. The plan was working, slowly, methodically, just as I'd intended. By the 12th day, another shift occurred, small, but unmistakable. During lunch at school, I sat in the teacher's lounge with Laura and 2 other teachers. We were discussing the upcoming field trip to the Science Museum, whether we should arrange for a guided tour or let the students explore on their own with worksheets. In the middle of that conversation, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I glanced at it, pressed decline, and set the phone face down on the table without missing a beat. I went back to my sandwich and rejoined the discussion about field trip logistics as if nothing had happened. Laura caught my eye and raised her eyebrows slightly, but she didn't say a word. She already knew enough to understand what that declined call meant. The look she gave me wasn't one of concern, it was quiet, proud approval. After lunch, as Laura and I walked back to our classrooms, she squeezed my arm gently and told me I was doing great. She didn't explain, and she didn't have to. I understood exactly what she meant. That evening, my phone rang while I was at pottery class. My hands were covered in wet clay as I worked on a bowl that, for once, was actually starting to resemble something Diane might not be embarrassed to display. I glanced at the screen and saw Daniel's name. Without pausing, I turned my attention back to the wheel, letting the clay spin beneath my fingers. Diane noticed both the phone and my choice to ignore it. She gave me a small, approving nod, the kind of silent understanding that passes between women who know what it means to let a phone ring when, for years, you've dropped everything at its first sound. When you've spent half your life jumping to meet someone else's needs, ignoring a call feels like reclaiming a piece of your soul. Over the next 2 days, Daniel called 6 more times. I answered none of them. Each ignored call felt like I was taking back a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd given away. Wednesday afternoon. Thursday morning. Thursday night. Friday at noon. Friday evening. Saturday morning. The calls kept coming, and I kept declining, each one easier than the last. It wasn't about revenge or cruelty. I was simply following the rules he had created. He was the one who said he would decide when we communicated, and apparently, he still hadn't decided. On the 14th day, the calls stopped. The text messages began. The first came during my planning period at school. It was short and polite, asking if I was all right. I read it and set my phone back down without responding. An hour later came the second, filled with confusion about why I wasn't answering his calls or texts. That evening, a third message appeared, and this one sounded different. The politeness cracked. Frustration leaked through the carefully chosen words. He wrote that he didn't understand what was happening, that we needed to talk, that my silence was only making things worse. I read each message as it arrived and deleted it without replying. What could I possibly say that wouldn't break the perfect logic of my silence? He had told me to stop bothering him, so I had stopped. He had said he would decide when we communicated, so I was waiting for him to decide. The fact that his attempts to reach out didn't count as deciding was a detail he hadn't thought about when he made his rules. By the end of the second week, the signs of his unraveling were impossible to ignore. He'd stopped eating proper meals. I knew that from the growing pile of takeout containers in the kitchen trash, greasy pizza boxes, Chinese food cartons, fast food bags. The man who had once demanded home-cooked dinners every night was now living off whatever arrived in a delivery bag. His dress shirts hung looser at the collar and shoulders, proof that he was losing weight. The dark circles under his eyes told their own story. He wasn't sleeping. I knew because I could hear him pacing in his office at 3 a.m, the floorboards creaking under his restless steps. Sometimes I even heard his voice, low and tense, talking on the phone at hours when no reasonable business call could be happening. His polished image, the one he'd spent years perfecting, the confident attorney on his way to partnership, was beginning to crack. One morning, I noticed a faint coffee stain on his tie. It was such a small imperfection, but I knew it was something he never would have tolerated back when I was managing the details of his life. His hair looked uncombed. Stubble shadowed his jaw where he'd skipped shaving. Even his expensive shoes had lost their shine. The man who had told me I would never be on his level was now discovering what his level really looked like without the invisible support system I had built around him for 3 years. Every small thing I had handled, every task, every reminder, every detail, was gone. And watching him falter under the weight of his own undone routines brought me a quiet, unexpected satisfaction. What Daniel didn't know, what he could never have predicted, was that while he was unraveling, I was building something solid and unbreakable. I'd been keeping notes on everything. While he was falling apart trying to manage his own life, I was creating a meticulous record of why our marriage had failed, and exactly who was responsible. In a small notebook kept hidden in my car, I wrote down every cutting comment, every time he prioritized work over our relationship, every casual cruelty that chipped away at me. Each page filled with evidence in my own handwriting. On a flash drive tucked safely away, I stored copies of our financial records, downloads Karen had told me to keep somewhere he'd never find. Those records made it painfully clear how much of my income had gone toward supporting his education, his career, his image. My own student loans, meanwhile, were still unpaid. I took screenshots of text messages where he canceled our plans with one-line excuses. I saved emails where he brushed off my concerns as unimportant compared to his workload. I even had a recording from our last attempted marriage counseling session, the one he refused to attend, in which the therapist noted his absence in her official report. Karen had gone through every piece of it with the precision of someone preparing for war, not just a divorce. She said the documentation showed a clear pattern of neglect and emotional disregard that would play very well in court, especially since his partnership was about to make him significantly wealthier. The revenge I was building wasn't loud or impulsive. It was cold, deliberate, and methodical, crafted with the same care I gave to everything I did well. Then came day 15, a Friday afternoon humming with that end-of-week energy every elementary school carries. My second graders had just been dismissed, and I was in my classroom organizing books for the next week when Mrs. Parker's voice crackled over the intercom. She asked me to come to the main office. Something in her tone made my pulse jump. It wasn't routine. There was an edge to her voice that made me quicken my pace. My mind leapt to the worst possibilities. Had something happened to my parents? Was my sister Sarah okay? The hallway walls were lined with colorful autumn art, construction paper leaves and pumpkins that usually made me smile, but they blurred past as I hurried. I passed the library, where children were sitting cross-legged on the carpet listening to Mrs. Taylor read aloud. I passed the gym, where the rhythmic thump of a kickball echoed off the high ceiling. When I reached the main office, I looked through the glass window and froze. Daniel stood in the school lobby wearing one of his expensive charcoal suits, the one he usually reserved for major client meetings. In his hands, He held an enormous bouquet of roses, easily 3 dozen stems wrapped in cellophane with a bow so elaborate it looked almost desperate. He looked completely out of place among the chaos of an elementary school afternoon, like a man who had suddenly realized just how far he had fallen. Children were being picked up by their parents, filling the school lobby with that familiar end-of-day chaos, backpacks being passed around, permission slips exchanged, shoes squeaking against the tile, and 6 conversations happening at once in different corners. The scene was loud and messy in the way only an elementary school could be at dismissal time, but in the middle of all that noise stood Daniel, still, silent, and out of place. He looked completely lost, like someone who had wandered into a world that no longer made sense. Behind the reception desk, Mrs. Parker caught my eye, and her expression spoke volumes without a single word. There was sympathy in it, yes, but also curiosity about what exactly was happening in her lobby, and what I planned to do about it. I noticed the other staff members trying to look busy while very obviously watching. Amy, my colleague from the 3rd grade classroom, stood frozen by the mailboxes, pretending to sort papers that she clearly wasn't reading anymore. Mark, the PE teacher, had stopped mid-stride in the hallway just outside the office, a pile of jump ropes and clipboards still in his arms. I drew in a deep breath and felt something heavy inside me settle into place. It wasn't exactly anger, though anger was part of it. It was something steadier, a mix of purpose and clarity. Straightening my shoulders felt like putting on armor. Then I walked forward into the lobby with slow, deliberate steps, every motion controlled, my heartbeat calm and even. The moment Daniel saw me, his face transformed. Relief flooded through his expression, quickly followed by a flicker of hope so raw it almost looked painful. He took a small step toward me, and I noticed the toll the past 2 weeks had taken on him. His charcoal gray suit was still pressed and immaculate, but his face was drawn and tired. The dark circles beneath his eyes had deepened. His skin looked pale, his collar hung loose, and there was something unsteady in the way he held himself, as though he hadn't slept properly in days. Before I could say a word, he started speaking. Words poured out in a frantic rush, tumbling over each other with none of his usual control. This man who had built his entire career on calm, measured arguments and flawless persuasion suddenly sounded disorganized, panicked. He told me he'd been trying to reach me for days, calling, texting, leaving messages, not understanding why I wasn't responding. He extended the bouquet of roses toward me like a peace offering, as if a display of wealth and effort could undo the last 2 weeks. He said he'd been under enormous stress because of the partnership review, that maybe he had said things he didn't mean. He admitted he'd been harsh and unfair. His voice softened when he said he wanted to make things right. Then he suggested we go to dinner that night, at Bellini's, the Italian restaurant I used to love. We hadn't been there in over a year because he had always been too busy, but now, suddenly, his calendar had opened up. He spoke about reconnecting, about us, about working through our problems. He said he missed me. Then he added, with a faint tremor in his voice, that he missed us. The word us hung in the air like a lie. Because there had never really been an us. There had only ever been me, giving everything, and him, taking it as if it were owed. His attempt at reconciliation felt rehearsed, like a performance he'd crafted in his mind on the drive over. I could almost see the gears turning behind his eyes, the lawyer in him calculating which combination of words might persuade me. But beneath the practiced rhythm of his sentences, I saw something else, genuine confusion. He didn't understand why it wasn't working. Daniel had spent his entire life solving problems through logic, persistence, and charm. He believed that showing up with expensive flowers and the right words could fix anything. As he kept talking, the sound in the lobby began to fade. The conversations, the laughter, the shuffle of footsteps, everything quieted. Teachers and staff were openly watching now. Mrs. Parker had pushed her glasses up onto her head and was staring at us without even pretending to look away. A small group of children waiting for their parents fell completely silent, sensing in that mysterious way kids do that something important was happening, even if they couldn't understand what. When I finally spoke, my voice carried clearly through the lobby. It didn't shake. It didn't rise. It was calm and steady, like I had practiced it in my mind 1,000 times. I reminded Daniel that 2 weeks earlier, he had laid out very clear ground rules for our marriage. He had told me he would decide when we talked or spent time together. He had told me to stop chasing him. This, I said, motioning toward him, isn't you deciding we should talk. This is you deciding you want to talk. And those are not the same thing. I explained that what he really wanted was for me to be available the moment he felt even the smallest discomfort, to drop everything and make his life easier again, to suit the consequences of his own choices. But that wasn't how this worked anymore. My voice stayed level, but each word was deliberate, sharpened with precision. I wasn't being cruel or emotional. I was simply following the logical conclusion of the system he had put in place. Daniel blinked, the confusion deepening. In his world, people didn't tell him no. Opposing lawyers argued, but eventually compromised. Clients questioned him, but in the end, they always agreed. Every problem he had ever faced could be solved with persistence, logic, and persuasion. But this time, I wasn't budging. And for once, he had no framework for understanding why. His expression hardened. The confusion turned into frustration, then anger. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his shoulders squared. His voice rose, taking on an edge sharp enough to make several nearby children instinctively back away toward their parents. He said I was his wife, emphasizing the word as if that alone granted him authority. He said I couldn't just ignore him for 2 weeks like he didn't exist. Then, in a tone dripping with irony, he accused me of manipulation, of being emotionally abusive. The absurdity of that accusation broke something loose in me. I laughed. The sound startled both of us. It wasn't cruel or bitter, it was real laughter, light, incredulous, a sound that felt almost freeing. Because the situation was ridiculous. Here was a man who had once looked me in the eye and told me I would never be on his level, who had said marrying me was an act of lowering himself, who had demanded that I stop chasing him, and now he was standing in my workplace accusing me of abuse for giving him exactly what he'd asked for. When I spoke again, my tone remained calm, my words measured. I'm following your instructions perfectly, I said. You told me to stop chasing you, so I stopped. You said you would decide when we communicated, so I'm waiting for you to decide. You said I was beneath your level, so I'm respecting your superior judgment by keeping my distance. The logic was flawless, the same calm, cold precision he had once used to restructure our marriage 2 weeks earlier. By now, everyone in the lobby had stopped pretending to work. Amy had given up on her mailbox entirely and was standing with her arms crossed, watching like it was live television. Mark had leaned against the wall, the equipment still forgotten at his feet. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dr. Collins, our principal, step out of her office. Her expression was controlled but alert, prepared to step in if things escalated, though I could see something else behind her eyes, a glint of approval. Daniel stood there, holding the enormous bouquet of roses that were beginning to wilt under the fluorescent lights. His face shifted between confusion, anger, and helplessness. I could see him searching for some angle, some argument that might restore his control, but there was nothing left for him to grasp. His mouth opened and closed several times before he finally spoke again. When he did, his voice had changed. The arrogance was gone. What replaced it was something small and almost fragile. It was the voice of a man who no longer recognized his own power slipping away. He asked me what I wanted from him. That question said everything. He still didn't understand. This wasn't a negotiation. I wasn't making demands or setting terms. There was nothing he could offer that would change what had already happened. This wasn't a contract dispute where the right offer could bring me back to the table. But Daniel didn't understand that. He shifted instinctively into negotiation mode, as if this moment were just another deposition to manage. He started making concessions, one after another, in carefully measured tones. He admitted he'd been stressed and had taken it out on me. He acknowledged that he'd said things he shouldn't have said. Each phrase sounded perfectly rehearsed, each apology calculated, his eyes darting to my face, searching for any sign that his strategy was working. He suggested that we go somewhere private to talk, like adults, he said, as if privacy would somehow make his cruelty easier to forgive, as if the problem were the audience, not the words that had shattered our marriage 2 weeks earlier. Looking at him then, standing there in the middle of the school lobby with his wilting bouquet and his pleading eyes, I realized something that felt as final as a closing door. I wasn't looking at the man I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. That man didn't exist anymore. This person in front of me was a stranger who wore his face. A man who truly believed that the right combination of words, gestures, and apologies could reset the story to his preferred version of reality. He thought he could apologize just enough, promise just enough, perform remorse just enough, and I would quietly step back into my old role, supporting his life, accepting his contempt, and pretending that love was still possible. The word that left my mouth was small, but it was the most powerful thing I had ever said. No. Just that. No explanation. No apology. No justification. I told him I wasn't going to dinner with him. We weren't going to talk. I was going to finish my work week and go home, to my apartment. I made sure to emphasize that last part. My apartment. Not our house. The apartment I had found, applied for, and rented on my own, without his input or permission. I told him I planned to spend the weekend there, enjoying peace, real peace, without walking on eggshells or wondering if my existence would annoy him. Then I suggested he should leave the school, return to his office, and start getting used to what life looked like without me managing every detail of it. My tone never changed. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I was calm, direct, factual, outlining the next steps like a teacher explaining the instructions for an assignment. The mention of the apartment hit him like a physical blow. I saw the shock move through him, his body actually jerked back a step, as if I'd shoved him. He repeated my words back to me, voice rising slightly. Your apartment? He said it like a question, even though I hadn't phrased it as one. His face shifted rapidly, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief collapsing into panic. He began to protest. He said we lived together. He said I was his wife. He said I couldn't just move out without discussing it with him first. His voice grew louder, strained, as if he were trying to restore authority through sheer volume. He was invoking marriage like it was a legal contract that bound me to him forever, regardless of how he'd treated me. But that was exactly his problem. The only language he knew was contractual. Daniel's mind had always operated like a courtroom. He thought every situation could be controlled with the right terms, managed through the right clauses, negotiated into compliance. He couldn't comprehend that some things simply exist outside that system. Some things cannot be managed or bargained or manipulated. Some things, like dignity, peace, and self-respect, are not negotiable. So I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Watch me." Then I turned and walked away. My practical flats squeaked softly on the polished floor as I moved down the hallway toward my classroom. Behind me, I heard him call my name, the sound sharp, desperate, carrying a kind of panic I had never heard from him before. It wasn't the voice of the confident attorney anymore. It was the voice of a man realizing he had finally lost something he could never win back. I didn't turn around. I didn't acknowledge him. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing that his words still had the power to reach me. I just kept walking until I reached my classroom door. I stepped inside, closed it behind me, and leaned against it for a moment, feeling my pulse racing from the confrontation. The room was empty, the students long gone for the weekend, and a deep, steady quiet filled the space. It felt more peaceful than our house had in months. The walls were covered with bright posters about perseverance, empathy, and respect, lessons I had been teaching to 7-year-olds every day while failing to demand the same from my husband. Across the ceiling hung strings of student artwork, self-portraits, colorful collages, drawings of their dreams and favorite things. Construction paper faces smiled down at me with captions in uneven handwriting. When I grow up, I want to be a firefighter. A vet. A teacher like Mrs. Myers. That last one always made my throat tighten. On my desk sat the Teacher of the Year award I'd received 2 weeks earlier, the ceremony Daniel had been too busy to attend. Though I'd always suspected the truth, he just hadn't cared enough to rearrange his schedule. The plaque was simple, but it meant everything. It was proof that what I did mattered. That the long hours, the patience, the love I poured into my students had value. I sat down at my desk and drew a deep breath. The adrenaline from the confrontation was fading, replaced by something steadier, something I could hold on to. Peace. Or maybe the beginning of it. The first few notes of a song I was learning to sing after years of silence. I looked around my classroom and reminded myself what was real. 22 second graders depended on me, to teach them how to read, to help them think, to show them how to solve problems with kindness instead of cruelty. They needed me to model empathy, respect, and patience. And I was good at that. Really good at it. In ways that had nothing to do with salary, or title, or any of the meaningless metrics Daniel used to measure worth. For the first time in years, my life was gloriously, unapologetically mine, and it felt incredible. That weekend, I met with Karen at her downtown office. She'd asked me to come in on Saturday morning to finalize our plan. The building was quiet, the marble lobby echoing under my footsteps as I rode the elevator up. Karen was already at her desk when I arrived, surrounded by neatly stacked folders, legal documents, and a steaming cup of coffee beside her keyboard. She laid out the next phase with military precision, her tone calm but decisive. By Monday morning, divorce papers would be delivered to Daniel's law firm. Karen had even chosen the process server herself, a man known for his impeccable timing and for ensuring such deliveries happened in the most public, visible way possible. Daniel's colleagues would see him being served at work, and the embarrassment would ripple through the firm like wildfire. By Tuesday, I would change my phone number. Karen had already arranged a new carrier account, one Daniel couldn't access or trace. By Wednesday, I would meet with a realtor she trusted to discuss selling the house, the one I had turned into a home while Daniel had treated it like a hotel. And by Friday, I would sign the lease on my new 1-bedroom apartment downtown, the one with exposed brick, big windows, and warm morning light that spilled across the floor. It would be entirely mine. A place without ghosts. I could decorate however I wanted, eat dinner whenever I pleased, live without constantly monitoring someone else's moods. Karen reviewed all the financial records I had collected over the past 2 weeks. She studied the bank statements showing how much of my income had gone toward Daniel's education and career advancement. She examined the student loan documents that proved I had carried debt so he could chase his ambitions. And as she flipped through those pages, she nodded slowly, not with pity, but with respect. Because what I was doing wasn't just leaving. It was reclaiming. Karen went over the final section of my file, the employment records that showed I had worked 2 jobs during Daniel's last year of law school and through his bar exam preparation. When she closed the folder, she smiled, and it wasn't a soft or comforting smile. It was the sharp, knowing smile of an attorney who fully understood how to make an opponent pay for his arrogance. She told me that Daniel's upcoming partnership, the very thing he had used as proof that I was beneath him, something he had wielded like a weapon to justify treating me as inferior, would actually strengthen my case. Because I had supported him financially through law school and the early years of his career, when he earned nothing, I was legally entitled to a substantial share of his increased earning potential. Karen estimated that I would walk away with enough money to completely pay off my student loans and still have a healthy financial cushion for whatever came next. The satisfaction that news gave me wasn't about the money. It was about fairness. It was about Daniel finally facing real consequences for the way he had treated me. Monday morning came with weather so mild it almost felt like spring. The kind of unseasonable warmth that feels like a small gift before winter fully arrives and makes you forget what gentle air feels like. I went through my teaching day with a focus and energy I hadn't felt in months. My second graders were working on a math lesson about addition and subtraction. As I moved from desk to desk, helping them with their worksheets, I found myself thinking about how perfectly those concepts fit life, adding what nourishes you, subtracting what doesn't. Removing what drains you, keeping what helps you grow. At 11:30, my phone vibrated on the corner of my desk. A text from Karen. Just one word, delivered. I quietly excused myself and stepped into the hallway, where I could take a breath away from 22 pairs of watchful eyes. The word on the screen seemed to glow. The divorce papers had been officially delivered to Daniel's law office. Karen had arranged for the process server to arrive mid-morning, precisely when the firm would be buzzing with activity. Maximum witness count, she had said matter-of-factly on Saturday when we finalized the plan. Daniel would open that envelope in front of his colleagues, and, with any luck, the managing partners deciding his partnership. I pictured his expression as he realized what he was holding, the exact moment when the smooth composure he worked so hard to maintain would crack in front of the people whose approval he prized most. The image didn't feel cruel to me. It felt right. It was justice, a small balancing of the scales. He had humiliated me in private for years. Now he would feel, in public, just a fraction of what he had made me feel behind closed doors. That afternoon, during my lunch break, I drove to the phone store. The clerk who helped me was efficient and polite, transferring my data and contacts to a new SIM card without asking any personal questions. Watching the progress bar move across the screen felt strangely meaningful, like watching a door quietly lock behind me. This new number wasn't just a change. It was a clean break, a new identity. Daniel would no longer be able to call or text. When he tried my old number, the line would be dead, the silence absolute. It was one more piece of proof that I wasn't bluffing, that this wasn't temporary. Back at school, I used my planning period to finish severing the remaining ties. I sat at my desk, methodically blocking Daniel on every social media platform, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. One by one, I erased every trace of him. Our accounts had carried a digital illusion of a perfect marriage, vacation photos from years ago, anniversary messages written like press releases, polished smiles that hid quiet misery. I deleted every one of them. I erased him online as thoroughly as I was erasing him from my real life. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected complication. I was walking my students to the pickup area at the end of the school day when I saw Jessica standing near the front entrance. Daniel's sister looked unlike her usual polished self. Her hair was slightly messy, her makeup uneven, as if she had rushed to get ready and hadn't had time to fix it. She waited until all my students had found their parents, then approached me with a mixture of distress and determination. She gestured toward a quiet corner near the main office and asked if we could talk. Her voice trembled slightly, the kind of tone that belonged to someone trying to make sense of a situation spinning beyond her control. She said Daniel had called her the night before, his voice frantic and panicked. He'd told her I had filed for divorce, that papers had been served at his office, that I had moved out without warning, that I was refusing to take his calls or answer his messages. Jessica admitted that her brother could be difficult, even controlling, but said he was under enormous pressure because of the partnership review. She said she thought we could work things out if we just sat down and talked. You shouldn't throw away 3 years of marriage, she said softly, as if the time itself was sacred, as if 3 years of endurance were more important than the pain that had filled them. I looked at her for a moment, deciding how much of the truth she deserved to hear. Jessica had always been cordial to me, even kind at times, inviting me to coffee, including me in family events, but she had always been Daniel's sister first. Still, she didn't deserve to be left in the dark, believing the version of events he was likely feeding her. So I told her. I told her exactly what Daniel had said that Tuesday night in October, every word. That he'd told me he couldn't believe he had ever lowered himself enough to marry me. That I would never be on his level. That he would decide when we spent time together and that I needed to stop bothering him. As I spoke, I watched her expression change. Shock came first, wide eyes, slightly parted lips, followed by visible discomfort, the kind that appears when someone realizes the story they've believed was a lie. She glanced around nervously, as if making sure no one was close enough to overhear, and then she said something that changed everything. Daniel, she told me, had been saying to their family for months that our marriage was basically over. He'd said he'd made a mistake marrying someone not ambitious enough to keep up with his career. He told them he was only staying with me out of obligation, but that once he made partner, he'd end things, because it would look better. Jessica admitted she'd argued with him about it. She said she'd told him he was being cruel, that I had done nothing but support him through everything. But Daniel had dismissed her concerns the same way he dismissed mine. She looked genuinely regretful when she told me this. I should have told you sooner, she said quietly. I hoped he'd come to his senses. I thought he'd realize what he was throwing away. Her words landed hard. Daniel hadn't just belittled me behind closed doors, he'd been dismantling our marriage publicly, too, rewriting the story to make himself the victim and me the burden. He had been so sure I would never leave that he'd already told his family our marriage was basically over, even while expecting me to keep cooking, cleaning, and managing his life as if nothing had changed. That made the memory of his shock when I left even sweeter. He had taken me so completely for granted that he couldn't imagine a reality where I actually walked away. I thanked Jessica for being honest with me. I told her I appreciated her telling me the truth and that I didn't hold any resentment toward her. But I also made sure she understood something very clearly: my decision was final. Daniel showed me who he really is, I said, and I believe him. Jessica nodded slowly. I could see the realization settling over her, the understanding that her brother had created this mess entirely on his own. By Wednesday evening, Daniel had apparently moved through several emotional stages in response to the divorce papers. That night, around 7, while I was in my new apartment unpacking boxes, my phone rang. It was Megan. Andrea had seen several posts Daniel had made on Facebook. Since I had already blocked him, I couldn't view them myself, but they were visible to our mutual friends and his extended network. Andrea read them aloud to me, her voice trembling with suppressed outrage. Daniel had written vague, self-serving statements about how marriage takes work and communication, about how some people give up instead of fighting for what really matters, about learning painful lessons about trust and commitment. Each post was carefully crafted to make him look like the victim, the heartbroken husband blindsided by a wife who had abandoned him without explanation. His colleagues and law school friends filled the comments with sympathy and support. It was clear they had no idea what had actually happened. They were responding to the story Daniel had built, one where he was the noble, misunderstood man suffering through my supposed cruelty, rather than the author of his own downfall. Andrea was furious on my behalf. She wanted to respond publicly, to write comments under his posts and expose the truth. But I told her not to. I'm not angry, I said. Just amused. Because that's all it was to me, a predictable attempt by a man who made his living spinning narratives to try and reshape the truth. I told Andrea exactly what Daniel had said to me that Tuesday night, the same words that had detonated our marriage, that he couldn't believe he had lowered himself enough to marry me, that I would never be on his level, that he would decide when we talked or spent time together, and that I should stop bothering him. And then I gave her permission to tell whoever she wanted. I was done protecting his reputation. I was done letting him twist reality into a version that made him look good. If he wanted to play the victim, then people deserved to know what kind of victim he really was. Andrea promised to handle it, to share the truth carefully but effectively. She had a wide network of mutual friends and an instinct for spreading information in exactly the right way. I knew that within a week, most of our social circle would know what Daniel had said and why I had left. When I hung up, I looked around my new apartment. Boxes still lined the walls, half unpacked. The few pieces of furniture I owned looked small in the space, but they were mine. Every inch of it was mine. No compromises. No shared ownership. No invisible weight of someone else's preferences. The dismantling of my marriage was moving forward exactly as planned. Karen's timeline was on schedule, every step unfolding with precision. Daniel's carefully constructed image was starting to crack as the truth spread through our mutual friends, and I was building something new out of the ruins, something entirely my own. 3 weeks after the divorce papers had been served, Daniel showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning. I had been unpacking the last boxes, arranging the kitchen cabinets with dishes and utensils that were mine alone, when I heard the knock. My stomach tightened as I peered through the peephole. There he was, standing in the hallway, holding 2 takeaway coffee cups from Brew Haven Cafe, the same expensive place we used to go during our first year of marriage, back when he still made gestures that passed for romantic. He looked terrible. Not just tired, hollowed out. His tailored suit hung loosely on his thinner frame. The dark circles beneath his eyes had deepened into something that looked bruised. His usually neat hair was rumpled, as though he had run his hands through it too many times on the drive over. I opened the door but didn't move aside. I stood in the doorway, blocking his view into the apartment, the space that represented my freedom, my future, my life without him. When he finally spoke, his voice was unsteady, tentative. "Can we talk?" he asked. He held one of the coffee cups toward me, and I noticed his hand was shaking. I took the cup, mostly to steady it, but stayed exactly where I was. Then he launched into a speech, the kind that sounded practiced, rehearsed, polished by hours of internal rehearsal. He said he had been wrong. That the partnership pressure had made him say things he hadn't meant. That he'd started therapy to work on his issues with stress and communication. He told me he finally understood how much I had done for him, how much he had taken for granted, how deeply he regretted the things he had said. He said he wanted to change, that he was willing to do whatever it took to fix things, to prove he could be the husband I deserved. I listened in silence. I let him finish every word. And when the room fell quiet, I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since my conversation with Jessica. "Are you trying to reconcile because you actually want to be married to me?" I said. "Or because your managing partner suggested that a messy divorce right before your partnership decision might make you look unstable?" The change in his face told me everything before he even spoke. A flash of surprise, the realization that I'd seen through him, followed immediately by careful, practiced neutrality as his lawyer's brain scrambled for a safe response. He denied it, of course. "Of course not," he said. "I want you back because I love you and I realize what I lost." But his words were hollow. His tone flat. His eyes didn't meet mine, they drifted somewhere over my shoulder, unfocused, distant. I told him that I had already discussed this exact scenario with Karen. She had explained how law firms often viewed personal chaos as a reflection of poor professional judgment, the kind of thing that could sway partnership decisions. His sudden interest in reconciliation, coming exactly 3 weeks after being served, right when the partners were finalizing decisions, was too perfectly timed to be anything but strategic. I watched him realize that I had seen through the act completely, that the woman he had once dismissed as naive and beneath him had been several steps ahead of him all along. The realization seemed to deflate him. His shoulders sagged. He looked down at the coffee cup in his hand as though he'd forgotten why he was holding it. I took a breath and said something I had been waiting to tell him for weeks. "You were right about one thing," I said quietly. "We're not on the same level. But you got the hierarchy backwards." I told him that I spent my days teaching children how to read, to think critically, to treat each other with kindness and respect. That I helped shape young minds, giving them skills that would ripple through generations in ways neither of us could ever measure. Every child I taught to read would go on to open doors that might otherwise have stayed shut. Every student I helped understand math would navigate life with more confidence. Every time I settled a playground argument, I was teaching future adults how to resolve conflicts without cruelty. And Daniel? He spent his days helping wealthy corporations find loopholes to avoid paying taxes and maximize profits, no matter the social cost. His work made the rich richer. It created nothing of value. It took from the world without giving anything back. Yes, I told him, your job pays better. But mine matters. Then I looked him straight in the eye. My level, I said, is just fine. I'm proud of my level. And I have no intention of descending to yours, where everything is transactional, where worth is measured by income, where love only lasts as long as it benefits your career. I told him the divorce would proceed exactly as planned. Karen had assured me that the settlement would be substantial, given that Daniel's partnership and the large salary increase it brought would legally count as marital property. I had supported him through law school, working 2 jobs and taking out loans I was still paying off years later. I had managed every detail of his personal life, bills, errands, appointments, even his dry cleaning, so he could focus entirely on professional success. Under state law, that kind of contribution entitled me to a significant portion of his future earning potential. I told him I would be walking away with enough money to pay off my student loans completely and start over with a solid financial cushion. Meanwhile, he would be learning a costly lesson, that treating people like disposable assets carries very real consequences. Daniel's face cycled through several emotions as I spoke. First shock, then a flash of anger, and finally something closer to defeat. But he made one last attempt to salvage control. His tone sharpened. He warned me that fighting the divorce would be long and expensive. His firm, he said, had top-tier attorneys who could make the process miserable for me. He told me I was making a huge mistake, one I would regret for the rest of my life. It was a threat dressed up as concern, and it confirmed everything I had already learned about the man I had married. I smiled at him. Calmly. It was the same composed smile I had given him that first morning when I'd stopped making his breakfast. I told him that Karen had expected exactly this kind of intimidation tactic, and that she was ready for it. I had documentation of everything. His verbal abuse. The financial imbalance in our marriage, proof that my salary had funded his progress while my own debt remained untouched. The way he had told his family our marriage was over while still expecting me to cook his meals and organize his life. I reminded him of the recording from our last attempted counseling session, the one he had refused to attend. The therapist had documented his absence and unwillingness to participate in her official records. Karen had explained that those notes could be extremely valuable in court. Then I told him that she was actually hoping he would decide to fight the divorce. Doing so would allow her to present every detail of his behavior in discovery and depositions. A messy, public divorce would be exactly the kind of professional disaster his firm viewed as a red flag, evidence of poor judgment and personal instability. The irony was perfect. The very thing he was trying to avoid by attempting reconciliation would become unavoidable if he chose to contest the settlement. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was a lawyer, he understood risk and consequence. He realized that fighting would cost him far more than the settlement. It would cost him his reputation, his partnership prospects, and his carefully crafted image as a man in control of everything. He stood there for a long moment, searching for some loophole, some argument that might still give him leverage. But there was nothing left. Every card he had played had failed. Finally, he turned and walked down the hallway without another word. I watched him go, his shoulders slumped, his stride smaller than I remembered. When he reached the end of the hallway and turned toward the stairs, I closed the door. For a long moment, I leaned against it, holding the expensive coffee he had brought me. Then I walked into the kitchen and poured it down the drain. I didn't need his coffee, his apologies, or his last-minute attempts to undo years of damage. I had everything I needed right here, in this apartment that was fully, completely mine. I stood there for a while, looking at the empty sink, feeling something shift deep inside. It wasn't triumph, not exactly, though there was satisfaction in knowing I had faced that final confrontation with total control. It was finality, the quiet certainty that the last thread connecting us had snapped. What remained now was just the legal process of making it official. 4 months later, that process came to an end in a sleek conference room at Karen's office. Daniel and I sat on opposite sides of a long mahogany table, signing the documents that formally ended our marriage. His attorney, a sharply dressed woman named Rachel, had clearly advised him not to fight. She reviewed the settlement terms with brisk professionalism, her tone suggesting she knew resistance would only make things worse. I signed each document as Karen slid them across the table to me. The settlement matched her original prediction, enough to erase my student loans completely, a substantial share of Daniel's partnership bonus, the one he had used as justification for calling me beneath his level, and half the equity from the house we had sold. It went quickly, snapped up by a young couple expecting their first child. They had loved the kitchen I'd renovated and the garden I'd planted with my own hands. Across the table, Daniel looked smaller, both literally and figuratively. His face was drawn, his suit hung a little looser, and there was a fatigue in his eyes that went beyond lack of sleep. He looked like someone who had aged 10 years in 4 months. We didn't speak, except for the required formalities. When Rachel asked if he understood the terms, he said yes, his voice flat and emotionless. When Karen asked if I had any questions before finalizing, I said no, and signed the final document with my maiden name, the one I had already begun using again. When everything was done, I gathered my papers and stood. Karen walked me to the elevator. As we waited, she told me she wished all her clients handled divorce with the same clarity and strategy one had shown. Most people, she said, let emotion drive the process. You played chess while he was trying to start a street fight. I thanked her for everything she had done and told her I sincerely hoped I would never need her services again. We both laughed at that, a small, dark laugh that belonged to two women who understood victory born of pain. When the elevator doors opened, I turned back once. Through the glass walls of the conference room, Daniel was still sitting at the table, staring blankly at the papers in front of him. He looked utterly lost, the same man who had once claimed he was far above me, now reduced to silence and stillness. For one fleeting moment, I almost felt pity. But then I remembered the years I had spent being told I wasn't enough. The doors closed, and I rode down to the lobby. Outside, the late winter sun felt warmer than it should have, spilling golden light over the street. I took a deep breath and walked toward it. 6 months later, I sat in my apartment on a quiet Saturday morning, drinking coffee made exactly the way I liked it, strong, black, and unapologetically bitter. My apartment was fully mine now, in ways that went beyond paperwork. The handmade pottery from Diane's classes filled the open kitchen shelves, each piece imperfect but meaningful, a record of Wednesday nights spent learning to shape something new from nothing but clay and patience. My books were arranged not by author or genre, but by when I planned to read them, my own private system that no one else would ever have to understand. Morning sunlight streamed through the deep blue curtains I had chosen myself, painting soft shadows across the room. The space felt calm. Peaceful. Alive. It felt like home. I continued teaching at the same elementary school where that unforgettable public confrontation with Daniel had taken place. If anything, my colleagues treated me with more warmth and respect than ever, as though I had passed a quiet but significant test by standing up for myself in front of witnesses. My second graders that year were a particularly wonderful group, curious, energetic, and full of the kind of questions that made me think carefully about how to explain complicated ideas in ways 7-year-olds could truly understand. All the energy I had once spent managing Daniel's moods and needs, I now poured into my classroom. My lesson plans became more creative. My patience with challenging students deepened. My enthusiasm for teaching, for shaping young minds, came back in a way I hadn't felt since my earliest years. The Teacher of the Year award, the spark that had unknowingly ignited everything, now sat on a shelf in my apartment beside the pottery I'd made. It reminded me that my work had always held value, regardless of whether anyone at home recognized it. I had reconnected with old friends and made new ones through Diane's pottery class and the book club Laura had invited me to join. My social life now existed entirely on my terms, built around people who added light to my life rather than draining it. My sister Sarah had become one of my closest confidants. Our bond grew stronger once I no longer had to pretend that everything was fine. We spoke on the phone several times a week and met for brunch every Sunday. Our conversations ranged from serious talks about our parents' aging to ridiculous debates about the reality shows we both secretly loved. One evening in early spring, Megan called with news she'd heard through what she jokingly called the law firm gossip network, her pipeline to people who still knew Daniel professionally. She hesitated before telling me, asking if I even wanted to hear updates about him. For a moment I considered saying no, but curiosity won. The partnership Daniel had treated as inevitable had been deferred, postponed for at least another year. The managing partners had expressed concerns about his judgment and emotional stability during what they called a personally difficult period. The divorce, and the details surrounding it, had reached the firm's leadership through channels Daniel couldn't control. They decided he needed to prove consistent professionalism before they would consider promoting him again. Megan said her source told her Daniel had been furious but powerless to change the decision. He would have to accept it and spend the next year rebuilding the image he had so carefully damaged himself. The thing he had valued more than our marriage, the achievement he had used to justify treating me as less than equal, had been delayed because of the very way he had handled our relationship. Surprisingly, I felt no triumph at this news. In those early weeks after leaving, I used to imagine how satisfying it would be to see his choices cost him professionally. But now, sitting in my apartment with the phone pressed to my ear, I felt only a quiet sense of justice, one that had unfolded without my help. It seemed that the universe had its own way of balancing accounts, no intervention required. I thanked Megan for telling me, then told her I was done following Daniel's story. I wanted to focus on building my own. She understood completely and shifted the conversation to other topics, as naturally as if we were closing a book together. That's when I realized Daniel had finally become what he was always meant to be, a person from my past, not someone who lived rent-free in my mind. As spring arrived, bringing warmer air and longer days, I thought a lot about what revenge really meant. The revenge hadn't been about destroying Daniel, though the financial settlement and his delayed partnership had certainly made his life harder. It hadn't been about public humiliation either, though the confrontation at my school and the gossip that followed had definitely cracked his polished facade. The real revenge was simpler. And deeper. The best revenge, it turned out, was peace. Waking up each morning without the weight of his moods pressing down on me. Moving through my day without walking on eggshells, without measuring my words, without worrying that some small comment might spark another argument. Coming home to silence that felt warm and calm instead of tense and watchful. The revenge was choosing myself after 3 years of choosing someone else. It was reclaiming all the energy, time, and tenderness I had poured into a man who mistook love for weakness and kindness for obligation. It was understanding that I had always been exactly enough, the right size, the right level, and that his inability to see that said everything about him and nothing about me. I was a teacher who helped children discover their voices, their potential, and their belief in themselves, and that was enough. That had always been enough. And if Daniel ever realized what he had lost, the woman who once loved him unconditionally, before he taught her that not everyone deserves unconditional love, it would be far too late. Because the woman he had tried to diminish had turned out to be stronger than he ever imagined. She had walked away with her dignity intact, her freedom restored, and her future shining wide open. And she was drinking her coffee exactly how she liked it, strong, black, and full of life, in an apartment that was entirely hers, on a Saturday morning that belonged to no one but herself. This story of calm revenge and reclaimed power had you completely captivated? Smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Emily stood in that school lobby and, with complete calm, told Daniel she had gotten her own apartment, watching his entire world collapse right in front of him. What was your favorite moment in her journey? Share it in the comments below, I'd love to know. And don't miss more powerful stories of resilience and justice like this one. Subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss a new story.